Spider-Man. Enjoy the fame while it lasts.
The superhero comic has conceptually always been about transformation, about identity, becoming something more than what the world expects of you. And yet, for a medium so obsessed with this idea of reinvention, it's taken surprisingly a long time for certain identities to be meaningfully represented on the page.
What does it mean to you to play as the first trans superhero?
Oh my gosh. I haven't really grasped that yet. I haven't really wrapped my head around being a superhero, first of all, and then also being the first trans superhero on television.
Transgender representation in media has historically been shaped less by visibility than by mediation, specifically by the ways trans identities are filtered through dominant cultural narratives that struggle to represent them as fully self-authored subjects. In Whipping Girl, Julia Serrano argues that transgender representation is frequently structured by what she terms cultural framing, in which trans people are interpreted through external assumptions rather than self-defined identity, resulting in portrayals that emphasize spectacle, deviation, or explanation rather than interiority or normalized existence. Within superhero comics specifically, this tension is especially visible due to the genre's reliance on transformation, dual identity, and metaphorical embodiments. The superhero genre is structurally organized around bodies in transition, where transformation and dual identity function as recurring narrative mechanisms that suggest fluid identity while simultaneously containing that instability within stabilized character forms. As a result, transgender identity has historically remained more often implicit than explicitly integrated into mainstream continuity. Within DC's publishing history, one of the earliest explicitly transgender characters is Coagula, created by Rachel Pollack during her run on Doom Patrol. Pollack's authorship is significant because it marks a rare instance where trans subjectivity is embedded in both character and creator rather than externally imposed. However, Coagula's brief presence reflects industrial constraints that limit the longevity of such characters within mainstream continuity. A different set of tensions emerges in Grant Morrison's The Invisibles, particularly through the character Lord Fanny. While often cited in discussions of queer visibility in comics, Lord Fanny's depiction has been critiqued for its reliance on mystical and exotic framing. This aligns with Betcher's critique of how queer and trans identities are rendered intelligible through culturally loaded narratives that can reproduce othering even when inclusion is intended. The 2016 independent comic Alters, written by Paul Jenkins, introduces Chalice as a transgender superhero whose powers and narrative arc are explicitly tied to bodily transformation. While this engages directly with trans identity, it also reflects a recurring pattern in superhero storytelling, where transformation operates as a metaphor, risking the collapse of lived identity into symbolic function. Taken together, these examples illustrate a broader pattern in superhero comics, in which transgender representation exists but remains unevenly distributed. Superhero bodies are repeatedly constructed as sites of transformation that are re-established within continuity, where difference is visible but rarely disruptive. Queer and transgender superhero representation often produces visibility without structural change, where inclusion does not necessarily translate into narrative or institutional integration. It is within this context of partial visibility, contested authorship, and constrained narrative integration that Dreamer enters DC Comics.
Sorry, hold the elevator! Excuse me, hold the elevator! I got it, thank you. Oh, I am late. You know, the crazy thing is, I am always punctual. Always. And of course, the one thing that matters, my new roommate took the keys to my rental car, accidentally, of course, and I had to take the bus. And I spilled coffee all over my skirt, and all I wanted to do was make a good first impression on Miss Danvers. It's you.
It's Kara, and do I know you?
Cara Danvers, wow. I'm Nia.
Oh, Nia, it's so nice to meet you.
The pages of DC Comics were not Dreamer's point of origin. She first appears in television, specifically the CW's Supergirl, when Nia Nal is introduced in the show's 4th season. This origin is significant because it marks DC's first transgender superhero in live action, and reflects a broader shift in cross-platform superhero storytelling. Contemporary media scholarship emphasizes that characters increasingly circulate across television, film, and comics as part of transmedia storytelling systems. Dreamer's introduction in Supergirl situates her within this system from the outset, positioning her as a character created within a multi-platform narrative environment rather than adapted from print. Central to this creation is Nicole Maines.
I think this character, Nia, is so good. And so she's pure. She has this fierce drive to protect people and marginalized communities. And I think she's going to be a lot of fun. And I think folks are really going to like her.
It feels like we're really at a moment now for trans representation on television. Why do you think it's taken so long?
You know, I think we've had trans representation in television for a while, but it hasn't been the right kind of representation. When I was first coming out to my parents, you know, late 90s, early 2000s, we had trans people on television portrayed by cis men as sex workers and drug addicts, which painted a very specific image. And having trans women portrayed by cis men contributed to that idea that we are men in dresses, and that was damaging for a long time. And so now it's very relieving and hopeful to watch creators and writers and directors and casting offices stepping up to put trans people in trans roles so we can portray ourselves and we can start to, you know, disprove some of those stereotypes about us.
Nicole Maines portrays Nia Nal and is credited as a co-creator of the character. Her involvement marks a departure from earlier patterns of transgender representation in superhero media, where characters are largely constructed without trans creative input. Here, representation emerges through lived experience, allowing for greater narrative specificity and resistance to reductive framing. Maines' dual role situates Dreamer within a model of representation that is participatory rather than externally imposed. This authorship is reflected in Supergirl itself. Nia is introduced not solely through her trans identity, but as a journalist, superhero in training, and member of the ensemble cast, with her identity forming one dimension of her character rather than being its defining limit. Kaputsa and Spencer identify this shift towards integrated characterization as a key development in transgender representation in media, where trans characters are increasingly allowed narrative continuity beyond moments of disclosure or explanation. Editorial coverage of Supergirl's 4th season frequently framed Nia Nal as a milestone in trans representation. This illustrates that Dreamer's significance is both textual and paratextual, shaped by how she is discussed and contextualized within media discourse. Dreamer's origins therefore represent a convergence of performance, authorship, and transmedia storytelling, marking her as an example of representation that is both inclusive and structurally embedded within contemporary production systems.
Quinn,
Oh, you're awake finally.
the Joker. Where?
It's just me, B-Man. No Joker, no gas bombs, no city in peril. Just you, that tank, and me.
Why?
To show Mr. J I could really pull off one of his plans. See, he could never get these fishies to smile. But then I had the bright idea of hanging the victim. That's you, upside down. That way, to you, it'll look like they're smiling. Clever?
Brilliant.
Dreamer's transition from television into comics represents a reversal of the dominant adaptation pathway in superhero media. This kind of reverse adaptation is not without precedent, but it remains unusual enough to be significant. One of the most well-known examples is Harley Quinn, who was originally created for Batman the Animated Series before being incorporated into DC's comic book continuity. However, even in Harley Quinn's case, her transition into comics occurred within a very different industrial context, one that did not yet operate under the same degree of transmedia coordination that defines contemporary superhero franchises. Characters in these transmedia franchises now function as mobile assets, where their movement across platforms is both expected and strategically managed. Dreamer's integration into comics reflects this evolution, marking her not simply as a character who crossed mediums, but as one designed to do so. Dreamer's first major comic appearances occur in Superman, Son of Kal-El, where she is positioned as a supporting character within John Kent's narrative. In a 2022 interview with Out magazine, Nicole and writer Tom Taylor framed Dreamer's inclusion as part of a broader push towards diversity within the Superman line. This reflects a shift from earlier, marginal appearances of transgender characters towards sustained ensemble integration. However, Dreamer is narratively present but not central, reflecting a broader tendency within superhero comics to introduce marginalized identities through supporting roles before granting solo narrative focus. Nia's relationship with John Kent further reinforces this positioning. Within the text, their dynamic is framed through trust, collaboration, and shared ideological alignment, situating Dreamer within the emotional and ethical core of the series. Some readers have interpreted their dynamic as potentially carrying a degree of romantic subtext. This is not an uncommon phenomenon within fandom cultures, where audiences actively interpret and expand upon character dynamics beyond their canonical framing. So yes, purely academically speaking, of course, there is an argument to be made that the Super Sun shipping is a crucial element to our understanding of Dreamer. Across Supergirl and Son of Kal-El, Dreamer's movement across media reflects transmedia storytelling logics in which characters circulate across platforms while remaining subject to franchise governance. Following this framework, Bad Dream, a Dreamer story, represents a rare moment in which those structural constraints are significantly reduced.
How did this come about for you? Where did this book start from?
Yeah, so I went to DC and was telling them, of course, Dreamer had originated on the Supergirl series, and I had told them, you know, this is a really spectacular character who is groundbreaking and means a lot for a lot of people, and, you know, we should continue her. She should have a legacy in the comic books. She should get to live on. And
written by Nicole and illustrated by Rai Hickman, Bad Dream centers Nia Nal as a fully interiorized protagonist. Rather than functioning within another character's narrative, she becomes the narrative anchor. This aligns with contemporary superhero comics' use of focused character narratives to deepen identity within larger franchise systems. What distinguishes the work is its refusal to treat Dreamer's trans identity as incidental or purely symbolic, shaped by Mains's own lived experience. Instead, identity is structurally embedded in her powers, emotional conflicts, and perception of the future. Gibson argues that superhero texts increasingly use bodily difference as a site where subject transformation and agency are negotiated visually. Bad Dream operates within this logic, where precognition becomes an externalization of identity formation rather than a simple narrative device. The story resists explanatory closure. Dreamer's visions are fragmented, emotionally taxing, and unstable. reflecting broader trends in superhero narratives that prioritize psychological interiority alongside external conflict. The result is a story that is not simply about what Dreamer can see, but how it is an inherent part of her identity and what it costs to have such abilities. Bad Dream, a Dreamer story, therefore consolidates Dreamer's character into a coherent narrative focus. It is not merely an expansion of her role, but a clarification of her subjectivity within the constraints of superhero storytelling. On a more personal level, this is a book that resonates deeply with me. There is a kind of emotional clarity in Bad Dream that feels unusually grounded and human within superhero comics. Something that makes it feel less like a representative milestone and more like an honest articulation of an authentic, lived experience. It's very relatable. It's fucking real. Quite simply, it is one of my favorite works in all of graphic literature. Though, and unfortunately, it's that same kind of specificity that makes it so hard to recommend in a more broad sense. Its emotional and thematic weight is inseparable from its framing. For all that I have said on this, and the hours that I spent writing this academic, analytical read of the text, Bad Dream is still, ultimately, a story about a transgender woman, and of her experience. Reality is, that may not fully land with readers who do not share that context, and maybe do not even understand that context. For me though, and as I said, on a personal level, textbooks closed, that is exactly its greatest strength. To me, Bad Dream is nothing short of a masterpiece, and I say that without any hesitation. Following Bad Dream, Dreamer's role shifts back into ensemble-driven storytelling. Across titles such as Suicide Squad Dream Team, Secret Six, and a central role in 2024's Absolute Power event, Dreamer's presence expands into event-based storytelling structures. Franchise theory identifies this as a common pattern, in which characters accrue narrative significance through repeated cross-title appearances rather than standalone development. This expansion also introduces structural constraints, as event-driven storytelling often disperses character focus across multiple narrative demands. Reception of Dreamer among transgender audiences has been notably positive. Queer and trans readers often value characters who are allowed narrative specificity within uneven franchise systems. Nevertheless, Dreamer's position within DC reflects ongoing structural constraints. Characters introduced through inclusion initiatives frequently remain dependent on ensemble or event-driven narratives rather than sustained solo acts. Inclusion often operates through managed visibility, where characters are present but structurally constrained. Culturally, Dreamer has been positioned within media discourse as part of a broader shift towards trans-inclusive superhero storytelling. Likewise, in a 2018 article for Glamour, pop journalist Christopher Rosa frames her introduction as part of this trend while also highlighting the industrial conditions that shape representation. Dreamer therefore functions as both symbol and structure, evidence of change, but also of limitation. In summation, Dreamer's trajectory across DC's transmedia ecosystem illustrates a gradual but meaningful shift in how transgender characters are constructed, circulated, and sustained within superhero storytelling. What emerges from this progression is not a simple narrative of linear improvement, but a more complex evolution, one in which transgender representation is increasingly present, increasingly nuanced, and increasingly authored from within lived experience. Ultimately, Dreamer is not a conclusion to a problem of representation. She is a process still unfolding, a character written across platforms that both enable and limit her. And perhaps that is the most revealing thing about her. She does not simply occupy the DC universe. She moves through it. And in that movement, Dreamer exposes the shape of a universe unto itself.